Look, it is lovely to talk to you formally, I suppose, and to be included in terms of presentations. Those of you who were eagle-eyed and were looking at the timetable may have noticed this was just included this morning on the timetable. So it is literally one I prepared earlier. So I'm just going to talk about developing a sense of community or a feeling of class community with those very, very large groups in large class context. And just as I said to you earlier in the introductory part of the morning, myself and Anna and some of other colleagues that are here in the room with us, we work in this classroom. We have up to 440 students in that room, and they are teacher education, they're student teachers, and will be qualified to work in primary schools and special schools. So it's a big cohort. The whole program has about 1,800. I love this classroom. I love this room. You can go back there, Anna. But it has its challenges, not least those steps, because one of these fine days I am going to fall down them as I walk around the room, and there's been a couple of near misses in the last couple of years. And as I said to you this morning, I stopped a number of years ago. I stopped saying this cannot be done with a large group, in favor of saying, how can I do that with a large group? Now, you can't do everything with a large group that you can do with a smaller group, but you can certainly do a lot. You can replicate it. It's just how you replicate it. And I think it's important to do that, not just around, you know, learning outcomes and that sort of thing, but around creating that sense of classroom community. Move on there. Large classes, when you read the literature around large classes, well, first of all, the first thing that will strike you when you actually start looking into this in detail is that, first of all, not only is the term large not well defined, a disagreed upon term, but so many journals and journal editors who accept papers for written around large classes do not include the numbers they are talking about, either in the abstract or even in the introduction. And it is only maybe when you get as far as the methodology of a paper, you finally discover how many people are in the room, or how many people are in the class, or are being referred to as, in inverted commas, large class. So that kind of inconsistency and lack of conceptualization, I suppose, is there in the literature, and it's probably coming from practice as well. And teaching large class, when you do read what's in the literature, it often talks about the challenges of large classes, the difficulties of large classes. So you'll see things, which are all true. You'll see things, you know, around how the difficulty teachers have in developing relationships with their students, and because of distance or because of numbers, or you know, how students are disconnected perhaps from their teachers, or where there's high levels of absenteeism. And as one of the speakers said earlier, anecdotally, there is evidence there that some institutions are quite happy for people not to appear on campus because they don't have a room big enough to actually cater for some of the classes that they have enrolled on their campus. So all of these issues, absenteeism, isolation, not just of the student, but of the teacher, impact on creating a sense of a classroom community, impact on that relational element between students and between students and teacher. So taking all of that as a given, what we are hoping and what we want when we're teaching our large or our small classes is that we don't have this guy sitting in front of us. And in a large class, he will be multiplied at scale, depending on how you're managing that teaching and learning context. This is an article from the Guardian newspaper in 2014 talking about ditching university lectures. And what was really interesting was that they didn't really define what they meant as the word lecture. So lecture is used in two different ways. I'm lecturing now. I'm talking at you. And in this physical room here, we only have a handful of people. And likewise online, it's actually quite a small group compared to some groups that we're teaching. So talking at people can happen with a tiny class. It's not necessarily only linked with very large groups, but it can be the default for very large groups. And if we assume that that's the only methodology that can be used for those really big classes. And that is probably one of the things in my experience that has the biggest impact on that sense of classroom community. So if there is a feeling of detachment, or if I as a teacher am nervous, or if I don't like teaching in this big group, students sense that, they pick it up, and it impacts on how they see themselves and how that classroom operates. Move on there, Anna. And these are just, like most of the other speakers with the short papers this morning, just some things, I suppose, that I've developed over the years, or I've thought about over the years, that I set up to enhance teaching and learning, but actually impacted on the sense of community and that feeling of a whole group being together. One of the things is enabling student voice, and we touched on it earlier. And I said earlier, a student doesn't need to actually speak to catch their voice. And going back to what Frederick was talking about in terms of universal design for learning, what I found useful was to map so universal design for learning, as you know, has the three pillars: are multiple means of representation, multiple means of engagement, and multiple means of action and expression. And in multiple means of engagement, we can harness what the students are thinking or understanding in a few different ways. And I know technology is very important, but sometimes the old-fashioned way works just as easily and just as well, depending on what you're doing. So myself and Anna co-teach in that big classroom. And in one of those workshops that we run, the students tear off bits of paper and write their responses to the questions we're asking them, or the tasks that we're asking them to do, pass it to the end of the row, and we collect them and we feed back then. So one of us will be up at the steps feeding back, while the other is down at the laptop typing in a summary of what is being said. And it's the students' words, so they don't have to speak. They're all engaged in the workshop. They're talking amongst each other, and there is a feeling of dialogue. It's just not the sort of dialogue you might necessarily have with a much smaller group. Another way I suppose one of the main things, I should have started with this, is linking in with class representatives. So most of you, I would imagine, will have class reps, student reps for each class. And I try to link in with them either online a week before a module starts, depends on the module, or with my first year class, I ask them to meet me 10 minutes before or after the very first session. And then I just explain what the module is about, what I'm hoping they will help me with. And sometimes, instead of myself and Anna going around collecting the pieces of paper, the class reps do that. I also ask them to model asking questions. And they kind of sometimes One or two will be up for it, but others will be saying, well, I can't do that in a large class. So I'll give them the questions that I want asked in the class on the first day. Nobody else, well, their friends will probably know, but the other 440 won't know that I've done that. And I use this throwable mic, the catch box. And one of the difficulties in a very large class is that if you're speaking, you have to raise your voice to be heard. So now not only does a student have to put themselves out there and speak, but they also have to speak really loudly. So it really puts them off. Whereas if they have a mic they can hold to their mouth, they can speak in their normal voice. They don't have to raise their voice. And it's a bit of fun. You throw it around the room. If it hits you on the head, it doesn't hurt. Sometimes some of the students aim it at my head. I'm convinced that they've done that. But there's a bit of fun and a bit of crack. But they are able then, they see in the first couple of weeks, the student reps. In week 2, I ask the reps to pick one friend each and get them to ask a question. So by the time we get as far as week 3, others that we haven't asked, we haven't targeted, start asking questions. Now, not everyone is going to speak, but at least some are speaking in the room. So we're gathering their voice on the catch box and so on, and the student reps throw the catch box, not me. So they move up and down the steps and throw the catch box or speak into it, and so on. We catch their voice as well. If I catch the voice as well with a Q&A platform. So either in your Moodle or your learning environment that you're using, or whatever sort of platform you're using, if you have some sort of a way of allowing students to ask. So what I've talked about here, the catch box could be asking or answering questions. The piece of paper could be either as well, but I usually use it for answering in the workshop. But for asking questions in class or between classes, having some sort of a question and answer platform is really useful, because anonymously, so that the students can post a question. I can answer it in class, and then I can answer it in writing afterwards. And it actually builds up a bank of frequently asked questions, so it can be carried on to the following year, year group that are coming along. Another way to get that kind of sense of community as well, one of the huge advantages of having a really big group is that chances are there are going to be people in that room who already know a lot about what you're going to teach. They already know something about it. And so for example, in my first year module, which looks at inclusion in primary schools, I email the whole class before the module starts and a couple of times during it to ask for volunteers who have some experience in the area. Maybe they have a sibling, or maybe they've worked in a club, or they've some work experience, whatever, or their own personal experience, if they would like to share it with the class. And even with shy first years, I will get at least 2 or 3, sometimes more, who will volunteer, who will email me back and say, Anne-Marie, I'd like to do that. Then I meet, there's a bit of work on this now. You have to meet them to make sure we're all clear on what we're talking about and which session it will best fit in with. But when a student stands up to talk about the concept that you're teaching, it pulls the rest of the students in. It makes it more real. And they ask, the catch box flies around in that session much more than it does in a session that I lead. When they're far more willing to ask their peer questions. And again, it creates that sense, it just it grows that feeling of classroom community. One of the things I hadn't appreciated up until COVID, I had used the virtual learning environment as a filing cabinet that I put up materials, that's what they looked at afterwards. I didn't think of it as anything other than a repository for materials for our module. And when we went online, that virtual learning environment became the classroom. It became the room. And particularly with large class teaching, a lot of as I mentioned earlier, the challenges that are thrown up about large class teaching are the same challenges that are thrown up about online teaching, fully online teaching. It's around distance, classroom community, all of those issues are mirrored in online online teaching and learning. And I learned over that 2 years the importance of the virtual learning environment. And I still not very good. I haven't maximized how I use it. But now, as well as maybe, you know, for example, I might give a written explanation of an assessment and the rubric to go with it. I will then have a 5-minute screencast explaining it so they can hear it and read it, and so on. Just having your voice in that space, or your face in that space on a video or whatever, I think just brings you closer, or brings them closer to you, and helps that it's just another link between you and the students and that sense of community. As I was saying earlier about the polling, I think the quizzes, particularly if you have, if you're able to you know, bring a bit of fun into the quiz, that those sort of quizzes, bring any sort of fun into the large classroom helps to create that sense of atmosphere as well. And yeah, I think they're the main points there. And I just want to move on. I'll give you a shout, because even though I'm not good at timekeeping myself, I've used Universal Design for Learn, the UDL framework, as a point of reference for my own teaching, generally. But I've embedded it in my 4th year module, which has about 400 people in it as well. I've explicitly embedded it. And again, not to create a classroom community. I'm thinking of a sense of community in the classroom. I did it to enhance learning, but actually, when I went back, Frederick mentioned the book and the chapter in his book from last year. When I was rereading it last night, I'd completely forgotten I'd written this in the conclusion. But it has changed my relationship. Using UDL has changed my relationship with students, because I'm much clearer on providing a wide range of choices on how I represent concepts, bringing in guest speakers, for example, and allowing, so we're looking at things like inclusion, exclusion, special education, inclusive education, all contested terms, nobody agrees, there's no absolute agreement on what any of those things mean. And I can stand up and tell them that, or I can get 8 people into a room and live it, where people will come in and speak about inclusion, exclusion, their experience as a mother, as a student, as a teacher, and so on. And that has altered that sense of community as well. And especially with the 4th years, I usually give them a good, how would I say, a farewell speech before they head out into the big bad world of for the next 40 years of teaching. And that helps in terms of the sense of community as well. I was standing with one of my colleagues, Farrell. She teaches in that classroom as well. And I popped in, I was in the classroom with her just before she started a lecture for about 10 minutes one day, a couple of years ago. And as her students were filing into the room, she interrupted herself talking to me, and she'd go, hi, how are you? Hello, oh, it's lovely to see you. Come on in. You can't beat a smile when people are walking into a room and saying, hi, how are you? In a very large class with hundreds of students, you might get to know 10 names. But that doesn't mean that you don't know them. It just means you don't know their names. And any class of any students, whether they're 4-year-olds or 64-year-olds, need to know their teacher really likes them and really likes being in that space and in that room with them. And that's probably, of all of the things, if you never had any technology and never did any workshops, just that. And come out from behind the podium as well. I have to stay here because of the camera, but this is not, usually in that big room, I'm up the stairs, down the stairs, up close to people, getting them working and sharing your proximity so that the people who sit at the back don't think it's a get out clause, that they're miles away and you can't see them, because I see them. And I'm up at the back, checking, looking to see what they're looking at on their laptops, don't say anything. But even that gives a sense of community in a class. It makes it feel like you're part of a group, albeit a very big group. Moving on there. Large classes, large massification is something that feels very new. This is a photograph taken on this campus in 1912, 110 years ago, and it's a large class. So it's not new. They didn't have any catch boxes or electronic quizzes or digital anything, but the same issues would have pertained back in the day. So yes, there's far more massification, and yes, there are far more really big classes around, but they're not totally new. They were around 100, 200, 300 years ago, and probably an issue. I think I read one article written in the 1950s talking about the difficulty of teaching large classes. So it's not a new thing. It's just much more prominent, and far more of us are working with those large groups than perhaps did in 1912. Just on again there, Anna. So thank you for listening, and I hope that was of some help, just a little insight into some of the things I've learned over the last few years. Thank you. Thanks, Anna.